take a little bit of a look at the global and local implications of corruption and some of the impact that it's been having. Corruption is a significant risk, and if you read the papers today, whether you're in the US or the UK or Brazil or China, more and more you're reading about corruption and the problems of corruption, and specifically about companies that are being charged with corruption and the significant repercussions of that. So here we look at just an example of some of the specific cases that have come up and some of the fines that have been paid by companies. These are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And in addition to the actual fines paid, these companies are spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on legal fees, on management time internally to deal with the issue, and on lost revenue opportunities. So clearly, the issue of corruption continues to grow as a global issue. And with globalization, it's becoming more and more of an issue because companies now have very complex global supply chains, both upstream on the supply side. I deal with companies that might have 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 suppliers, and each of those suppliers can have dozens and dozens of subcontractors. So on the upstream side, we have really, really complicated supply chains. On the downstream side, companies are increasingly selling in emerging markets. Dealers, distributors, sales agents, all of these organizations are third parties that you're dealing with that also put you at risk for corruption. Now, if we think, and again, this is kind of some basic setup here, but if we think about the business impacts of corruption, of course it disrupts business operations. And business continuity is a critical issue for everybody. If we look at supply chain risk, one of the top things that come up is supply chain continuity. How do I make sure to get my goods, get them to market in an efficient, continuous stream? Disruptions in supply chain continuity are really debilitating, and they have a very, very direct financial impact on the bottom line. So that piece alone is something that really needs to be looked at as a risk area. It also opens a company to continued extortion. We hear from companies in emerging markets that once they have paid a bribe or a third party that they're dealing with has paid a bribe, word gets around. And other companies or other organizations or other government agencies are coming to get their share of the pie. So you want as a company to think about how do you prevent that from happening? How do you stop that first incident from occurring? Of course, you could be excluded from bidding on certain contracts. Insurance premiums can go up once there's been an incident or a conviction related to bribery. I mentioned before about the money damages and financial loss, which can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Legal proceedings, the time that takes, the legal fees that are incurred with that are huge, huge costs there. Walmart has already spent, I think it's over $200 million on legal fees in response to the situation that they had in Mexico. The other thing that happens is reputational harm. And if we think about a company, increasingly now companies are looking at, investors are looking at the idea of a company's reputation, its brand value, its reputational value. And of course, corruption significantly hurts reputation. It hurts it in the eyes of investors. It also hurts it in the eyes of potential employees. Good companies now are always looking for ways to attract and retain high-quality talent. And having corrupt activities, having a lax attitude toward corruption is a detriment to that. A lot of good people don't want to work for companies that are are involved in corrupt activities. So the other thing, in just a quick look here, if we look at the map, this is put out by Transparency International, And this is a map ranking the different countries for the level of corruption. And the darker the red, the higher the level of corruption in that country. But what's interesting here, one, we see that most of the world is red, but even countries like the United States and in Western Europe, we see that they're orange. And that means that it's not something that is only prevalent in emerging markets. Corruption is something that has to be dealt with across the board in all countries that you deal with. And as a corporation, it's important to put in a culture that prevents corruption from happening. And we're going to talk a bit about how you start to do that. But the idea that it's, oh, we're dealing in the United States, or this contract is in Australia, we don't have to worry about it at all, is wrong. That's why it's important to start to think about this from an organizational standpoint, and how do we as a company start to embed in our operations a systematic way to prevent corruption. A little bit of background here on the legal framework. And of course, a lot of this started with the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act. Those were really two of the first laws that started to address this and put forward legal guidelines about what the responsibility of a company was. Since then, more and more additional countries have started to adopt laws. Brazil's Clean Company Law, China's Criminal Code, both specifically prevent corruption. A lot of the things that come up with this look into the idea that there is increasingly international cooperation between countries in trying to prosecute corruption. So this is something that you need to be aware of also, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but it really is a case more and more where one country is cooperating with another country to look at cross-border types of corruption. And it's something that you as companies need to be really aware of. How do you deal with that? How do you start to prevent third parties in your supply chain from being involved in corrupt activities? How do you start to change the mindset? The other thing that comes up is the idea of extradition, and specifically that individuals as well as corporations can be charged. So these are the types of things that are happening in the legal framework, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more in the next slide. But think about this is that the laws are increasingly becoming international, and more individual companies are creating their own laws for in their jurisdiction. So what are the common features of these anti-bribery laws? And if we look at them, there's a lot of similarities between the laws. And for you as global companies, or companies even operating in a second country, some of these issues are very, very important for you to understand. So one is the extraterritoriality of it, so that it doesn't have to happen in the country where you're domiciled. You're responsible for the activities of third parties that take place in other countries and can be charged here in the United States for the activity of a third party in another country. Criminal and civil offenses, so they can both be charged criminally or civilly from a civil standpoint. One of the things here is that it also covers bribery to foreign government officials, is really the focus of a lot of the laws. So if you look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, a lot of the focus there is on payment to government officials, but increasingly the laws are also starting to cover domestic and commercial bribery. So an example of commercial bribery would be a kickback scheme to a supplier. You or your sourcing people agreed to pay a supplier X% of the purchase price if the contract's awarded to that supplier. Payment through third parties is clearly prohibited. And related to that, you are assuming the liability for the actions of third parties. And this is something that makes the idea of a system or a way to cascade the policies that you have at headquarters to third parties so important. The idea is, how do you then start to prevent third-party corruption, or at least how do you start to isolate it and make sure that it's not viewed as a corporate activity, that it would be viewed as the activity of a rogue individual. And the final two here is that there is corporate liability and also individual liability. So senior executives in an organization can be charged as individuals. And of course, as I mentioned before, if they're rogue individuals or the people actually paying the bribes can be charged individually, as well as the corporation being charged. So these are some of the things that are coming up. There was a recent case, the Embraer case in Brazil is kind of interesting. The U.S. and Brazilian governments cooperated. Embraer is a Brazilian aircraft manufacturer, and they were selling planes in the Dominican Republic, so not in the U.S. or Brazil, but in the Dominican Republic. They found that representatives of Embraer were paying bribes to win contracts in the Dominican Republic. The U.S. and Brazil cooperated to bring the case forward. So that's a great example of kind of this cross-border cooperation and international cooperation that's starting to take place. So what we're going to take a look at now is a little bit on specific risks related to third parties. And we've started to talk about that a bit, but I want to step back and talk to you a little bit about risk. And one of the things that we think about with risk is, if you look at enterprise risk management and corruption, companies really need to start to more formally integrate corruption into how they do enterprise risk management. A lot of companies now look at financial risk, operational risk, reputational risk. They're not always looking specifically at the risk of corruption. And that's something that really starts the whole process going, is to identify what are the risks that your company faces from a corruption standpoint. And then how do those impact the other areas? How do they impact supply chain continuity? How do they impact your strategy? How do they impact your operations or your reputation? So corruption needs to become part of that. And the first simple thing to do is literally to start to list what the risks may be. You can do this from a business unit standpoint, looking at different business units. You could do it geographically. But it's an important thing to start to think through a little bit, is just to start to list what are those risks. The next thing that happens with enterprise risk management, and is really the critical step, is to start to assess or rank the risks. And the way that most organizations do it is to look at the probability and the severity. So if we look at a risk, what is the probability of that event, negative event happening? And then what would be the impact if it happened? So as you start to, once you've listed the risks, the next step really is to start to think through severity and probability. A lot of companies use a simple 1, 2, 3 ranking. Some companies use red, yellow, green. Whatever the case may be, at least it starts to get you thinking in a systematic way about your risks. I'll tell you a little story. We were dealing with one company, a mid-sized global company that had 8 different regional offices. And the first thing that we discovered is that headquarters was pretty confident that everybody was on the same page, and they knew about their corruption policies. They knew that everybody was supposed to be meeting local legal requirements around corruption and gift-giving and bribery. But when we started to survey the regional offices, we found that only 3 of 8 even knew the company had any kind of anti-corruption policies. So right off the bat, headquarters had not really communicated effectively about that. But then if you drill down one level to the risk, we were talking to one of the regional directors, and they said that their business really revolved around selling equipment to government officials in an emerging market, and somehow they consider that low risk to bribery. Everybody else in the world that would be familiar with it would think that's a high risk activity. They, for whatever reason, thought it was low risk. Why? Because they felt they were selling through dealers or through agents, not really aware, one, of the company's policies, but two, not aware of the liability that they had for third parties. So that's why this risk assessment is such an important piece, because it starts to get everybody on the same wavelength together. Then finally, and we're going to go into this a little bit more later, but what steps should a company take to manage the risk? So we go through the assessment. We have 10 or 12 or 20 different risks, and we've prioritized them. And we look and we see, okay, we've got 4 high-risk areas. What do we do? And we're going to get to that a little bit later. We can give you some really, really practical advice on what you can do. But that's where it really starts to happen, is to manage the risk. How do we minimize the likelihood that it's going to happen? And if it does happen, how do we minimize the negative impact? And that's where that third part, the management, is so critical. So who's a third party? And we talk about third-party risk and the liability that you have for third parties. Here's a partial list of the types of third parties, but we find in a lot of cases people aren't really thinking of all of these different types. So here's, agents, consultants, distributors, dealers. Of course, even attorneys and accountants could be a type of third party, as well as joint venture partners. These are all external groups that you have relationships with. Others that aren't on here would include suppliers, would be another one that could be on here that you need to be aware of. It's really any entity that you're signing a contract with. So if we start to think about the risk, we've gone through that risk assessment. That's the first box up here. But then what, from a practical standpoint, if we're focused on third parties, what do we do in a practical way to start to assess the risk that an individual organization would have for us? And how do we start to systematize the due diligence that we do to try to reduce our risk? So the first step really is to start to communicate to the third parties. Let them know about your policy. We have sample letters and things like that, forms that can be used to do that, but it's really just a way to notify and to start to build awareness among third parties that you do have a policy and that you do have an expectation. And that expectation is that they will meet your policy. And your policy could be as simple as they need to meet local law, but you as an organization have to communicate that to the third parties. The next would be to consult local or in-house counsel regarding local law. You want to be careful in different countries about the actions you take and the type of due diligence that you conduct. And that's something that it's really smart to get some guidance on that from local counsel or from your in-house counsel. Next, we get down here, and you want to collect data. So we're going into a new country, and we understand that country X in Asia is a high-risk country, and we want to do things to try to minimize that. And we're going through and we're picking a new dealer, and we have 4 or 5 candidates that we're looking at. We want to start to collect data on those dealers so that we then can start to use that as one of the criteria to select one of them, so that we're not only picking them on their financial stability or on their business capability, we're also from the start starting to think about their anti-corruption program. Is this company going to put us at high risk, given that we're in a high-risk country? We want to pick a company that is going to reduce our risk. So we want to collect data on them. Have they had previous incidents? What is their relationship to government officials? Things like that. We then want to validate that information. Do some background checking, do some research to make sure the information that we get is validated. Next would be to start to identify red flags. And in any type of due diligence process, there are certain things that can be there in your questionnaire that would be red flags. It may be that, obviously, if they had a past conviction for corruption, big red flag. But what if they used to be a government official? And what if one of their selling points to you is that they have great relationships with the government, and you're dealing with somebody who was an ex-minister or an ex-assistant minister or whatever it would be? That might be a red flag. It doesn't mean you can't do business with them, but you should have your eyes wide open and be prepared to do a little bit more due diligence around that issue. Next, of course, would be to assess and resolve the red flags. Which of these red flags, now that we've done the research and validated, which of these can we live with? Which of these can't we live with? How do we pick the dealer based on the different red flags that we have in conjunction with their business capabilities? Perform necessary follow-up. This is where a lot of programs drop off, is these last two boxes here. If we look back here at the follow-up and the monitoring, this is where a lot of companies are weak. Even if they've gone through the process, they get to the point, they sign the contract with the dealer, they don't do any monitoring or follow-up. They don't do any kind of ongoing assessment to see if their risk is increasing or decreasing. And certain things change. In any organization, change is a constant. And what we're looking at here is, imagine you've hired that dealer, and then 6 months later, they do hire an ex-government official. Would your risk go up? I would say yes, in many cases. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing, but for you to be blind to it is a bad thing. So that's where that monitoring needs to take place. You'd want to make sure that that new person coming into that company was aware of your policies, your procedures, and your expectations. That gets into the manage piece that we talked about before. So here's a list of third-party red flags. I'm not going to read through all of these, but if you can take a look at this, I'll highlight a couple. Also, we're happy to send this, we'll be sending this slide deck out to all of you. So you'll have a list here, and you can use this as a reference point. This could be really useful for you. But some of the things here, you see refusal. So if that dealer that you're evaluating the dealers and they don't want to tell you who really owns the company, I mean, that's an obvious red flag. That would have issues beyond corruption over to also financial stability and a host of other things. But these are some of the other things. Reputation we mentioned before. What if they have a lack of experience in the field, but they claim they can get you a contract? That would be a red flag. How are they going to get the contract? If they've never sold whatever it is, electronics before, but they claim they can get you a big contract with the government, that would be a red flag. Insistence on payment in cash, another red flag. Some of these are really clear, but they need to be part of a formal process that you go through. Because, and we're going to get to this in a minute, having a system in place is a defense that your corporation was not involved in this, that it was the actions of rogue individuals. So keep that in mind. As you build your system, you're also building a better defense should anything happen in your supply chain. So we talked before about assessing and resolving the red flags. So one of the ways that you do that is to go to that company and say, hey, these are some issues that concern us. We got your assessment back. We did a little bit of background research. These are some things that concern us. Let's sit down and discuss it. How do you feel at the end of that discussion? Do you feel better about the relationship or worse? The other thing you might want to do is strengthen your contract at that point. If it's a situation where you have some concern, you could start to put provisions in the contract that would give you the right to monitor, that would require the third party to conduct routine anti-corruption training for all employees, that would require them to do training for all new employees within 30 days of hiring. All of these are pieces in place that help to protect you and help to reduce your risk. The other thing here we see is the unannounced spot checking. You know, as with any kind of audit situation, if the organization knows they're going to be audited, they can do prep to prepare for it. If they don't, they can't. So you might want to build in there that you can come in and do some kind of unannounced spot checking of financial records or interviewing of different people or things like that. Finally, you might even want to consider providing training and capacity building and keeping a record of the fact that you've done that. If you could show to an investigator or government officials that you actually had trained all of your dealers and agents, and you have records of having trained them on a routine basis, that gives you a great deal of risk mitigation. So here's a case about a lack of due diligence. And this case is a little old, but nonetheless, it's really, really applicable. So the founder of a luxury handbag brand, Dooney & Bourke, had decided to diversify and decided to invest $8 million in privatization of the Azerbaijani state-owned oil company. What happened here is he was charged with bribery because the local agent that he used was found to be paying government officials to secure the business. So here the founder of a handbag company was charged, and he alleged that he did not know, that he did not direct the bribe and he did not pay the bribe directly. But the government actually charged that he should have known. And he said that they said that willful blindness is not a defense. And they said he should have done due diligence to know that Kazeni was engaged in a bribery scheme, because Kazeni had a history of bribery in Azerbaijan. Ultimately, Bourke, the founder of the handbag company, was sentenced to time in jail and $1 million fine, and he lost his $8 million. So here we learn a couple things. One, we learn that he clearly had not done a risk assessment. He didn't understand the risk of a country selling a state-owned company. High-risk situation to begin with, extremely high risk. Two, he didn't do any due diligence on the third party that he was giving his money to invest. So these are all really, really classic mistakes and things that you can prevent. These are all preventable things. And we look at here, what happened is the negative repercussions to him were significant. Financial loss, time in jail, fines, hurt reputation. So some top tips related to dealing with third parties, and then we're going to dig into really the meat of a management system for protecting anti-corruption. But a couple tips now that are really best practices from what we see around the world. One is the story just highlighted. Do your due diligence. It's not a waste of time. It's critical, and have documentation around it. The thoroughness of it can be scaled to the situation and the risk. So that's another thing with the risk assessment, is the risk assessment allows you to strategically allocate your resources. You have X number of hours a day. You have Y number of people that you need to cover. How do you cover that? How do you cover those third parties? The risk assessment is what you use to prioritize. But once you've done that, you really need to conduct due diligence on those at least the high-risk areas. Use your contracts wisely. Really think about adding contractual provisions that will reduce your risk, giving you more control in terms of monitoring them, possibly we mentioned before, training requirements, certain metrics that they would have to do, and adding remedies to the contracts. All of these are things that will help to reduce your risk as you move forward. Communicate and train. Critical piece. You need to train your own employees, but also that of third parties. And that's something that you as an organization can do that's really a value add. One, it reduces your risk as an organization, but it also helps that third party to reduce their risk. Because remember, you do have liability for the actions of a third party operating in a foreign country. So how do you sleep at night knowing that? One of the ways you sleep at night is knowing, hey, we did a training for them. When we did our supplier summit or our dealer summit, we had a training in there on corruption. I have a record that all the key people took the training. Those are the types of things that help to reduce your risk and make it easier for you to sleep at night. Monitoring, we talked about that before, is critical. We're going to talk about that a little bit later again. And then finally, enforce and improve. So if you find problems, you need to act quickly and have a documented record of the actions that you take. We're going to talk a little bit more about corrective action and the corrective action systems in a minute, but that idea that you move quickly is important. So what we're going to do in this last bit is dig a little bit more into what does a good anti-corruption compliance program look like? What are the parts of it? And these are some really, really practical things that you can look at and how you look at your organization and your third parties. When we put this program together, we looked at compliance guidelines from a lot of different sources around the world. All of these resources are really pointing in a similar direction toward what does a good anti-compliance program look like. Now, we did some research on this, and what we found was kind of surprising, is that 70% of the companies don't have financial controls designed to specifically detect corruption. 80% didn't have employees for their own employees, any procedures for their own employees. Another thing that was down here is 86% do not monitor the anti-corruption compliance of their supply chain and business partners. As I mentioned before, monitoring was a really weak area. Too many companies either hide behind their policy statement or they hide behind and stop when they sign the contract. So the contract has a couple sentences: you will not violate local anti-corruption laws, you will not violate FCPA laws, period, the end. That's not good enough. What we want is companies to think about how you use a management system to improve this. And when we talk about a management system, in my definition, trained, committed people routinely following procedures to achieve something. Now, if we break this down, trained, committed people, this part, what does it mean? It means we've done training. It means we have commitment. And to get commitment, it means that we have to have senior management commitment. Routinely following procedures. What that means to me is that the procedures need to be practical. Because if you look at any kind of compliance program, if my job is to sell widgets and the compliance department sends me some new procedures that make it really hard for me to sell widgets and meet my quota, I'm not going to follow the compliance procedure. I will work around it. I will do what I can to at best comply with it in the most minimal way, but really I'm going to just keep doing my job and try to ignore it as much as possible. So trained, committed people routinely following procedures, that's a management system. It's about implementation. It is not about writing documents. So what are the parts? And I'm going to skip forward and then back. These are the 7 parts of a good anti-corruption compliance program. And I'm going to skip forward one slide and then come back to this. What we do is you want to look at these on a maturity level of 1 to 5. So how strong are these? How mature are you? And the thing I want to highlight here is we talk about being reactive. We talk about inconsistent implementation. We start to talk about systems well developed and implemented. So as I go through these categories on the previous slide, I want you to think mentally, where is my company? Are we a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? And where are some of my key third parties? Joint ventures, distributors, subsidiaries, regional offices. Where do you think they are? So keep the 1 through 5 in mind. The first thing, policies, procedures, and records. Really foundational. Do you have policies? That's the rules. Do you have procedures? Those are the steps that you want people to follow, to use to follow the rules. Do you have records? The records are what would show a third party, an investigator, that people were following the rules. Policies, procedures, and records, really a critical foundational piece. I mentioned before, a lot of companies hide behind a policy statement. And having a policy statement that says, you know, whatever your policy is related to corruption or bribery is not enough. That's the easiest thing to look behind. If there's nothing behind it, you might as well not have the policy statement. Next, we look at the anti-corruption compliance team. And here, at a more mature level of 4 or 5, should be a cross-functional team. And why cross-functional? Is because we want to embed it in how your company operates and how you deal with third parties. And if you in the compliance department or legal department sit there and do this on your own and then push it out to marketing or sourcing and don't involve those departments and don't involve finance and don't involve HR, your program is most likely going to be really, really difficult to implement. And we have so many companies tell us, you know, Craig, writing the stuff was relatively easy compared to implementing it. And I'm right. I say you're absolutely right. Implementation's the hard part. That's the thing that makes it work, though. And if you write things in a way that make it difficult to implement, it won't get implemented. So that's why this is important, and you got to think cross-functional here. Next, scope and quality of the risk assessment. We've already gone over risk assessment, but think about how mature you are. Do you have a system on that? If I came to your company and said, could I see the last risk assessment you did, either by country or business unit or third party or transaction type, would you have it? Next, management of supply chain. This is really the classic due diligence. What do your contracts look like? What does your due diligence look like? And how mature is that? How thorough is that? How routinely is that done? Now again, the risk assessment should be what allows you to strategically allocate resources to managing the supply chain. If you have 10,000 suppliers, you can't wake up tomorrow and snap your fingers and think it's going to be done. But where do you start? And you need to start because you don't want to be in the same place 5 years from now that you are today. Next, training and capacity building. Obviously foundational. We can have great policies and procedures, but if we haven't trained our people, we haven't built awareness of them, it's worthless. And this really, at a mature level, should be extended to third parties, especially high-risk third parties. Monitoring and measurement and corrective action and improvement. These really come out of quality management. And for any of you familiar with ISO 9001 or some of the quality management systems, they all talk about continual improvement, the idea of plan, do, check, and act. And the monitoring is how we get data on how our program's doing. Do people follow our procedures? And then corrective action is, what do we do? So we understand that people aren't following the procedures. Let's say in a regional office, nobody's following the procedures. Why not? So at a mature level, we would do a root cause analysis. And we would look underneath the surface, and instead of just screaming at them saying, you better follow these procedures, we'd say, hey, is it that the procedures are ineffective, incompatible with their job? Are they good procedures but we haven't trained the people? What is the issue here? And that's what a good corrective action system does. And the other thing that it does is it enables you to share information throughout your organization, to be able to centralize it. So if we looked, going back to the company with the 8 regional offices, if we suddenly find out that only 3 of 8 even know we have policies, that gives us great information on what we could do. Clearly, we have a communication and awareness issue. How do we deal with that? It could be done very simply. A letter from the CEO, reissuing the policies, putting them in the newsletter, sending them out through the intranet. Whatever it would be, at least we know what the problem is. So these are the components, or we call them process categories, within an overall compliance program. And if you look around your company, you'll find that there are a lot of things that are happening that use similar structure. So if you talk to your quality management people, you'll find a lot of similarity. If you talk to the people involved in occupational health and safety, you'll find similarity. If you talk to people involved in labor and environmental compliance in the supply chain, you'll find similarity. These are not new concepts, but these are the way that you need to start to frame your program. And one of the other things is that you can't improve what you don't measure. So if we go back to here, if we find out that we're a 2 across the board, that's not necessarily bad. It just shows us where we're starting. Some people say, I don't want to get measured because I don't want to know that I'm not good. That's like a death wish. That's like saying, you know, I don't want to go to the doctor to have my blood pressure checked because it might be high. It's ridiculous. You want to get measured because once you're measured, then you can start to identify how to improve in a practical, systematic way. So we're coming to the end now, and I'll leave some time at the end for questions. But this is our program and kind of how we approach it. And we have an offer for you to a way that we could start to get involved with you, and I'll talk to you in a minute. But our program, I mentioned before, measure and then improve. So how do you measure? We have an online self-assessment where you would go through and answer a series of multiple choice questions, and it would give you a maturity score in each of those 7 categories on a scale of 1 to 5. Next, we then would conduct an independent evaluation. And what we do for most companies is we then have our experts talk to you and interview you and do a document review so that we then can provide a maturity score in our opinion. Not to say whether you're right or wrong, but simply to provide an outside expert opinion of where we think your system is from a maturity standpoint. So that's the measure piece. And from that, we generate a report. We can give you benchmarking data so you can compare yourself to others. We give you recommendations as to how we would strategically prioritize resources. All of those things become kind of the end of the measurement piece. And then we move into improvement. What do we do to improve? And we have a guide that we can provide you, 200 plus pages with step-by-step guidance. You got a 2 in training. Here's some things you can do to move up to a 3. your distributors are all getting a 1 in monitoring. Here's some things they could do to move up to a 2. All of it is geared to drive improvement. But if you don't measure, it's hard to improve. So we like to go through that measurement piece first. What I wanted to offer now is we would be happy for anybody who's participating in this to go through what we'll call a guided self-assessment with you. And it's not really a full independent evaluation, but you would log in to the online self-assessment, and we would have one of our experts on the phone with you, kind of explaining the categories, explaining the questions, maybe giving you a little bit of background or insight, not evaluating you from our point of view, but kind of guiding you through the self-assessment to make it more of a learning experience for you. And we think that this is a great way for you to start to understand the strengths and weaknesses of where you stand now. And then ideally from there, it gives you some ideas for improving and how to move ahead. So that's really the end of what I wanted to, what I'd prepared to talk to you about. We still have a few minutes left. Again, I apologize that Leslie wasn't here. She's our vice president and a real subject matter expert on corruption, and she really could have shed some more light on some of the laws and the issues around the legal framework. So it's really unfortunate that she wasn't able to attend. But hopefully you got a value out of this overall. And I think that the key thing, the takeaway that I want to have you leave with is the idea that you really do need to start someplace. And you can't ignore the issue. Willful blindness is not a defense. And I'll give you one more quick story. Morgan Stanley, there was an executive from Morgan Stanley that was charged with corruption and bribing government officials in an Asian country. And when they started, the Department of Justice started to investigate the case, they looked through and they looked at the program that Morgan Stanley had in place, the records, the policies, the systematic training, the ongoing monitoring, all of the pieces in those 7 categories. They weren't all 5s, but they were all in place and functioning and being implemented. And Morgan Stanley as a company was not charged. The individual was charged. So that ultimately, if you think about risk mitigation, having an effective compliance program is really the ultimate way to mitigate your risk. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. Send them in through chat. Okay, I have a first question coming in. The first question says, about how long, I'll go back to this slide, about how long does the guided self-assessment take? If you do this self-assessment on your own, it's usually about 60 minutes. With the guided version, I think you should probably allocate 60 to 90 minutes. But that extra time is really, should be of value and very educational for you. Okay, we have another question coming in. This question has to do with going back to risk assessment. And they're asking specifically if there are certain types of things that should be considered in a risk assessment. Yes, there definitely are. We wrote a white paper about enterprise risk management and including corruption in it that's available for free on our website. So please feel free to download that. But really some of the things to think about, of course, are country risk. Then you want to think about transaction risk. Some transactions are riskier than others. Of course, the risk of what are the types of third parties. So an extreme case, if I'm selling heavy equipment to a private company in Norway versus selling heavy equipment to a government agency in Indonesia, I would have several different types of risk there that would be evaluated. So there are very specific things you should be looking at related to transaction, size of the transaction, and things like that. And then involvement of government officials. And then the other thing I mentioned before is it's important to come up with some simple ranking system. 1, 2, 3, red, yellow, green, whatever it is you decide to do, that's an important way to go also. Any other questions? I'll give it a couple minutes, and if no more questions, then in a minute or so, I'll just wrap up. One more question just came in, so I'm going to go back to this chart here. The question was, how could you start to evaluate yourself on this? And again, I think we have that guided self-assessment would be one way, but another thing you could do just sitting there right now, sort of on the back of an envelope, is just mentally go through this and just write a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 next to each of these boxes. It's not nearly as sophisticated, but it gets you thinking. And that's what we want to do. We want to get you thinking about what do you have in place now and what do you need to improve. So that's another quick way for you to get started on that. And anybody who's here, also check our website. We have a lot of resources on our website. And feel free to send us an email if you have any questions. We will send out this slide deck. And get in touch if you have any interest in the guided self-assessment. I'll give it one more minute, and then I'm going to sign off. Again, thanks to all of you for attending. Really appreciate it. We're always here to help you, either with anti-corruption issues or also with protecting intellectual property. We use a similar type of approach and framework for protecting intellectual property. I don't see any other questions coming in now, so unless anybody rushes to send me a question, I'm going to sign off. And again, thanks a lot, and we're always here if you need us. Bye-bye.